Good night guys, this is Edward Buck making here with another video, and in tonight's video what I'm going to be talking about, it's a topic that I haven't really got a chance to talk about. I did make a video on this, but before I could publish and upload it, my laptop charger stopped working and I had other issues. Thankfully, I've gotten a new laptop, so I should be able to work on this topic quite well now that I have nice and new equipment. Tonight's topic, as I've mentioned before, is going to be Operation Talpiot. Now, Operation Talpiot is essentially part of the programs that were created during the during the initial stages of the first World War, which, as some of my viewers will realize, has never really ended. Despite the propaganda and the claims that a peace treaty was signed, this has never happened because there was no internationally recognized peace treaty that could actually say that yes, this was ended. As a result, this war continues unofficially. Officially, it continues out of sight and out of mind. Instead of being a physical war as it was in 1914, it is now a psychological war, with the aim being to essentially brainwash the citizens of the world to forget the truth and to forget the honesty. Honesty. The Talpiot program is an essential part of this brainwashing plus democratic program. Operation Talpiot, in simple terms, is a deindustrialization slash espionage program designed to steal the technological advantage of the two Reichs. In other words, the Kaiserreich, right? The legitimate German state, by the way, the Bundesrepublik Deutschland, or Deutschland, or the so-called Constitution Reich, is not the legitimate state of Germany. It seized power from another illegitimate state, the Weimar Republic, which itself was a puppet state set up by the Allies during World War I Central Power, and transferred the stolen technology not only from Germany, but also from places like Japan, which is unfairly dependent as being imperialist and an evil power due to propaganda, and send it to places like Russia, Iran, Venezuela, and so forth in order to gain, in order to continue the existence of the Cold War. In reality, the Cold War is essentially fake as all powers are owned by the same people. The parasitic international banking and financial class, situated mostly in London and Shanghai, consists of the landed families of China and England. This is who the real power in the world is. It does not lie in politicians, nor does it lie with this craving, corrupt communist dictatorship of strength and people. This is the real power. Those those who dress in multi-million-dollar suits and lead the most charmed lives, recognizable. They are the ones who, using their control of money supply and psychological warfare passed on from generation to generation, are the ones who have tied us to a lifetime of debt and have essentially pledged themselves to one goal: the total consolidation of power and control over everyone on this planet. Muppets, such as Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump, are only the puppets they use to distract us in their scheme. Before I continue, I'm going to make one thing clear. Leaders like Vladimir Putin, Bashar al-Assad, Rouhani, Lukashenko, Lukashenko and the current ruling party of Hungary are not our friends. I repeat, these people are not our friends. They are agents. They have been specifically placed in power in order to create a fake opposition and bolster the narrative of the global right-wing communist conspiracy that has been propagated by groups such as the John Birch Society and the successor foundations in the fact-checking organizations and the liberal mainstream press. The main reason for the propagation of this right-wing communist conspiracy is a distraction to distract people from international banking, Zionism, and divide and rule topics. That is just one thing to make clear. Now, I'm going to play a video that is basically going to debunk many of the myths Soviet agents and British propagandists have spread through the years concerning the relationship between Soviet Russia and the British colony of Israel. Please watch carefully.
Meanwhile, Israel's Prime Minister Naftali Bennett has met with Russian President Vladimir Putin for the very first time for talks focusing on Iran and other regional security issues. The two leaders also met at Russia's Black Sea resort in Sochi. Russian President Vladimir Putin hailed the warm relations between the two nations and noted that the two shared some common ground and also some opportunities for cooperation in the Middle East.
Did you see that, folks? I told you.
Putin hoped for continuity of the trusting relationship that Russia has built with the previous Israeli governments.
I hope that despite the internal political battles over Russian-Israeli relations, your government will pursue a policy of continuity. We have developed a fairly business-oriented, trusting relationship with the previous government.
Mr. President, for more than 20 years, you have been promoting this process of deepening ties between our countries and bringing them to this level. I want to tell you on behalf of our entire country and all of our people, we see you as a very close and a true friend of the State of Israel.
Now, over the years, Russia and Israel have developed some close political, economic and cultural ties. The strong relationship has also helped the two countries tackle some delicate and very divisive issues, such as the situation that is unfolding in Syria, where Moscow has teamed up with Tehran to shore up the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad's rule. And this, of course, puts them in direct conflict, possible conflict with the Americans and the Israelis, who also seek to operate in certain zones in Syria.
As you know, we have been making efforts to help restore Syria's statehood and to strengthen it. There are also problems here, quite a lot of them. At the same time, there is also common ground and opportunities for cooperation, especially in terms of the fight against terrorism.
The two leaders also held talks on efforts to halt the Iranian military's nuclear program. The Israelis view Iranian entrenchment on its northern front line as a bit of a threat for them. Israel has repeatedly struck what it describes as Iran-linked facilities in Syria. Moscow, meanwhile, has played a very delicate diplomatic game of maintaining friendly ties with both Israelis and with the Iranians, although the Russians actually operate along with the Iranians in Syria. Now, Russia happens to be one of the international parties that negotiated the 2015 nuclear deal with Iran. The deal fell apart in 2018 after the American president described the deal as the worst negotiated deal in American history and decided to unilaterally walk out of it. The Biden administration is trying to make some feeble efforts to try and revive the deal with other international powers, a step that Israel strongly opposes. According to a Kremlin spokesperson, Putin's talks with Naftali Bennett is the last in-person meeting for the Russian president, who will temporarily cut off face-to-face interactions with other world leaders due to the rising number of COVID-19 infections within Russia. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.
Did you see that, folks? Are any of you people starting to get concerned yet? Are any of you people worried yet? Well, you should be, because your supposed enclave of democracy and inclusiveness within the Middle East is actively collaborating with an expansionist, genocidal, war crimes denying, ultra-nationalistic state, which basically wants to revive its last glory. And for some of you liberal Zionists who are going to throw a fit and basically accuse you of being anti-Semitic, well, I have one advice for you. How up? Take a trip. I don't care about your hurt feelings. This is the truth. Truth. And the truth does not fear investigation. Yes, sir. Since 2016, the world press has been basically fed fantastical stories about Donald Trump working with the Russians in order to steal the election from Hillary Clinton, who in herself is essentially the epitome of the failures of the American political establishment. However, what many people don't know is that Russians and their allies implicated in the collusion were heavily connected to Israel. They were heavily connected to Israel, with many of them being Zionists. Yes. The mainstream media didn't tell you that, oh, your heroes, Mueller and Comey didn't get together and tell you that. Well, you heard it from this exile junk on YouTube. And for those of you who are going to see, that's just a conspiracy theory. You don't have any evidence to prove that, man. Well, there was a US Senate report that basically concluded the same thing I said. I'll post it up, and people can look it up for themselves. It's time for us to start thinking and start being led astray by the so-called internet heroes and social media influencers who basically call themselves journalists. For example, during this Russiagate scandal, how many people realize that Vladimir Putin is a devoted Zionist who is basically wedded to Israel? During the war in Syria, Putin and Israel's former president, Benjamin Netanyahu, whose real name is Benjamin Michalowski, to make matters clear, were closely collaborating in the genocidal war. Many enlightened people know that Russia, Hezbollah, Army of God in English, and Lebanon supported the tyrannical evil regime of Bashar al-Assad. However, what many of these people don't know is that Israel also supported the government of Bashar al-Assad. That's right, Israel, the only democracy in the Middle East, supported the genocidal, murderous, lunatic dictator Bashar al-Assad. This was another point that was missed by the Russiagate radicals because the Trump-trained communist retards. The main reason for these topics bypassing the mind of the American people is due to a successful campaign of psychological warfare and brainwashing that I have mentioned before. However, we cannot lay all the blame on the Russians, as their forces within the United States actively working to promote its balkanization. The greatest of these forces is the Christian Identity Movement, which is essentially the largest terrorist movement in the United States of recent experience. Despite being implicated as a racist extremist cult, Christian Identity enjoyed extensive support from the elites of the Democratic Party, especially the faction associated with the Clinton family, Nancy Pelosi, Joe Biden, and his mentor, Robert Biden. Christian identity essentially got the United States involved in the First World Creed, which provided no benefit to the United States of America, and essentially caused America problems which it suffers to this day. Christian identity was also involved in the OKC bombing, which essentially killed hundreds of innocent people. The beliefs of Christian identity being spread among the low class of American white males has essentially led to America being involved in hundreds of foreign wars and foreign entanglements in direct defiance of the United States Constitution. Now, why is Christian identity so dangerous? Christian identity is a spin-off of another cult famous among the British elites known as British Israel. Both Christian identity and British Israel share one thing in common: the belief that the Anglo-Aryan, Nordic, Scandinavian race are the true 12 tribes of Israel, or the descendants of the 12 tribes of Israel which lived in Palestine many years ago, and as a result, these peoples possess the divine right to rule. Any of you people getting concerned yet? You should be. The main difference between British Israel and Christian identity is that British Israel advocates sharing the supposed power gained from the descent of the 12 tribes of Israel given to the white race with radical Zionist organizations such as the Likud in Israel, and the AFD, Alternative for the Deutschland in the Bundesrepublik, the Deutschland land, in order to rule the world. Christian identity, however, does not believe in the sharing of power with these radical Zionist organizations and wishes that the Anglo-Saxon Nordic race be the true rulers of the earth, under the belief that they are the descendants of the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, many enlightened people on both the conservative or the Bolshevik side, or the progressive or liberal nationalist side will condemn both ideologies as racist and reactionary, and they should condemn these ideologies as racist and reactionary. However, due to an intense propaganda campaign and re-education program, many people are not aware that this cult exists. Speaking on the topic of Russia, there is another cult in Russia with a similar goal. The Russian counterpart to Christian identity in the American liberal movement, the Third Rome, and unlike Christian identity, which prefers to mark itself by hiding behind intersectionality, feminism, and after movement, Third Rome primarily operates on a conservative, pseudo-nationalistic and Zionist platform. Third Rome now essentially is the belief that the Russian state is the current incarnation of the Imperium Romanum, or Roman Empire in English, which sometime after the death of Christ was split in two. The Western Roman Empire prior was the state whose decline caused the Dark Ages. However, in the East, the Roman Empire remained, where it gained the name Byzantium. When Byzantium fell to the Ottomans, the dynasty that would rule the states of Turkey, Palestine, Syria, Arabia, Egypt, and Iraq until 1918, seized the capital of the Roman Empire, or Byzantium as it is known today, Constantinople. The daughter of the then reigning Roman emperor, married the Russian king. This led some scholars in Russia to believe that believed that Muscovy, as Russia was known as, was the true inheritor of the legacy of the Roman Empire, and that Moscow had become the third Rome. This ideology, however, did not appear until the 1980s, in which an anti-Western faction led by KGB head Yuri Andropov seized control of the Soviet government. This anti-Western faction needed a means to justify its rule, and thus the idea of Third Rome was thus born. Ironically, both cults have been fighting each other via the Cold War for a long time, but both of these groups are controlled by the same sources. In order to fully comprehend the dangers that these cults are to liberalism, to freedom of speech, to self-determination, and other basic rights, let me play the following clip.
Woodrow Wilson, our first intellectual president, and the first modern progressive in the White House.
Woodrow Wilson locked up his opposition, opposed free speech, deported people for their political views.
Who keeps saying that? Woodrow Wilson's portrayed as the first modern progressive president because he's the one who brought the academic class in Washington. He's bringing the brains, the intellect, social engineering, but he's also bringing with it oppression and arbitrary control of the economy.
You might think if a college professor took power in the White House, that person would probably be more or less against war. But that's not what happened in the case of Woodrow Wilson, of course. And beyond that, we're given the impression that progressives in general tend to be against war. So if they favor one, well, that's just an exception. But that's really not true. A lot of progressives supported the Spanish-American War, and nearly all of them lined up with Wilson demanding U.S. intervention into World War I. And of course, the U.S. intervention turned out to be a complete fiasco. It helped to encourage the rise of Bolshevism, it helped to encourage the rise of the Nazis, and when you look at the motivation, at the double standard behind Wilson's intervention, it becomes preposterous. Wilson was basically fighting for a principle no country had ever demanded before, which was that during wartime, you ought to be able to book passage aboard an armed, belligerent merchant ship carrying weapons of war through a declared submarine zone and be perfectly safe while doing that. Well, you might as well take the position that people should have been able to walk right through the Western Front and not get shot at. This is not reasonable.
You see other examples of Woodrow Wilson trying to have it both ways with regard to U.S. entry into World War I. In 1916, he was barely reelected to his second term on a promise of he kept us out of war. But once he got us into the war, those who campaigned to say that it was terrible, that the draft is something that shouldn't be happening for sending American troops overseas, those are the people he chose to lock up. He imprisoned the people who called out his BS when it came to his campaign promise of 1916, just a few months prior.
Maybe the best-known case of a poor soul imprisoned under Woodrow Wilson was Eugene Debs, a presidential candidate who in fact ran for president again from prison. He had given a speech saying basically that the war effort was only going to enrich the capitalist class and wasn't going to benefit the average person. Well, whether that's right or wrong, it's not the kind of remark that normally winds somebody up in prison. And in fact, when Wilson was asked for clemency toward Debs, he rejected all such appeal.
He didn't just put his political opponents in jail, he kicked them out of the whole country. Emma Goldman, Alexander Berkman, and dozens of other anarchists and other radicals who had lived in America for decades, Wilson had J. Edgar Hoover round them up, take them to Ellis Island, and quote-unquote send them back to countries they'd never been in since they were kids, specifically for their political views. Tom, you want to make the world safe for democracy, don't you?
I most certainly do not.
I hope you were paying attention when the video was playing, because that video, even though it's done by a neocon, communist, Russia supporting Bolshevik, supposedly conservative communist conspiracy type people. It basically gives a good explanation as to the type of person Woodrow Wilson really was. And facts like this are important because in this age of disinformation, revanchism, war crimes in Ireland, portrayal of victims as expansionists and imperialists, the truth is very important. Now, the photo that is going to come up was screenshotted from a publication by an investigative outfit known as the Executive Intelligence Review. Now, the Executive Intelligence Review has basically fallen by the wayside in recent years due to the fall of the Soviet Union and the founder, Lyndon LaRouche, getting sucked into Eurasianist disinformation such as America and the West being evil and Russia and China being good guys. However, these excerpts from his articles shows the very close relationship between Israel, China, and the established National Socialists in the United States. Now, many people are under the belief that fascism and National Socialism is a right-wing ideology. No, fascism and National Socialism can come from any ideology and any ideology. The real name of the Nazi Party was the National Socialist German Workers' Party. ND, no, I honestly don't remember the acronym number, but that's what it's in English. And in order to seize power in China, Mao and this gang of thugs basically posed as communists. Yes, yeah. That's the reason why China acts like a national socialist state, despite claiming to be communist and peoples, because they're not communists, they're national socialists. It's just like Israel, which was swarmed by England and the Bundesrepublik Deutschland, or the supposed constitutes Reich. Reich has a very close relationship with communist Russia and the Fox News Bolshevik establishment in the American right wing, but is actually a fascist state, as is shown when Israel was literally backing the National Socialist Ukraine and also backs the National Socialist Modi government that is engaging in an intense terror campaign against Muslims. Now, how many people know that Israel has been giving away sensitive, top-secret American technology to fascist China and communist Russia for the past 50 years? Raise hands. The answer is you haven't got a chance to that because you'll be distracted with stuff like Donald Trump, the joke right-wing in America, climate change, and the COVID deception campaign. Now, how many people know of the multipolar world order that is going to be pushed by operatives such as Vladimir Putin, which they claim will be a counterpart to Western imperialism? None of you don't know that. Let me make one thing clear. The multipolar world order is not a Russian plan. It's not even a communist plan. It's an oligarchist plan, a Zionist plan, a British imperial plan for the entire world. And the Ententesche forces under the disguise of, claiming to fight US imperialism. There are some problems with the American military and with the American culture in general, but most of these problems have been artificially created. That's right, they've been artificially created to deceive and destroy Americans by consistently harping on pointless issues. And that's the truth. Now, I'm going to be playing a clip that basically comprises in a mainstream format the essence of what I've been trying to say. Don't be shocked, guys. This is what has been going on behind the scenes. While your favorite internet stars tell you crap about Black Earth, Alex Jones, Tucker the Bolshevik, and all sort of foolishness designed to lead the people astray with the devices of the joke. Divide the empire, the policy of the imperial commander. Now, let the game begin.
China-Israel ties grew rapidly in the early 2000s in a variety of fields, including diplomacy, trade, investment, construction, educational partnerships, scientific cooperation, and tourism. Israel wants to strengthen diplomatic, economic, and strategic connections with the world's fastest-growing major economy, as well as diversify its export markets and investments away from the US and Europe. And China desires Israel's sophisticated technologies and values Israel's location as part of the Belt and Road Initiative. In recent years, Chinese investments in Israel have grown substantially. And former Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu attempted to deepen ties with China and attract Chinese investment in Israel's infrastructure and technological industries. They include investments in high-tech firms that manufacture sensitive technology, as well as the building and operation of critical infrastructure projects. Chinese investment in sensitive technology and the development of key Israeli infrastructure raise serious worries for the United States and also for other countries who purchase defense equipment from Israel. Last month, on the 14th of December 2021, the Joe Biden's administration and the Israeli government conducted low-key talks on China and many other difficult matters that given American fears over Chinese investments in Israel. Furthermore, a week after the meeting, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan raised some of the same concerns with Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett and Foreign Minister Yair Lapid. Sullivan's key points were Chinese engagement in infrastructure projects, Chinese hacking, and the necessity for a united front against China. According to reports, the Biden administration was putting more pressure on Israel and other countries to choose sides in the US-China conflict. According to commentators, Israel's leadership caught between continuing a balancing act in order to retain business connections with China, while also standing more actively with the United States, its closest geopolitical ally. Security risks for Israel and the United States. According to analysts, there are 4 kinds of security dangers for Israel and the US. Israeli and Chinese interests in the Middle East are incompatible. Because of the nation's Middle East goals are incompatible, Israel faces the risk of a schism in its relations with China. China's mix of economic and geostrategic objectives may pose a threat to Israel for 2 reasons. First, given China's close ties with Iran and China's opinions and interests in the Middle East sometimes contradict Israel. Second, given the trade war between the United States and China, Israel may find itself on opposing sides with the United States, its most important security, diplomatic, and economic ally. Furthermore, Israel's engagement with China would heighten the risk of large asset concentration in the hands of Chinese firms at the expense of local and other foreign businesses. Government or military ties of Chinese companies doing business in Israel. The bulk of Chinese firms are controlled by the Chinese government, and the strong association between Chinese firms and the Chinese government shows that commercial actions are motivated not just by economic factors, but also by China's geopolitical objectives. Chinese investments and construction activities pose cyber and intelligence risks. Although the Israeli technological industry is mostly geared westward, Chinese investment in technologies, especially sensitive ones, as well as the building and management of critical infrastructure, pose a variety of cyber and intelligence-related potential concerns for both Israel and the US. One critical problem is China's desire to acquire technology that can be utilized for both commercial and military goals. Chinese investment and building operations bring up a plethora of chances for cyber-enabled and open-source information gathering. For example, the Shanghai International Port Group has been awarded a 25-year contract to run a new terminal port adjacent to the port of Haifa, commencing in 2021. Another major risk is cyber espionage. China's investment in Israeli cybersecurity firms poses risks for both Israel and the US Department of Defense. The transfer of proprietary information used to develop these cybersecurity capabilities could be used by China to bolster its own cyber defenses or reverse engineered to identify software vulnerabilities. The impact on the Israel-US relationship. In addition to cyber and intelligence threats and classic hard power challenges, China is using its investment and other soft power efforts across the world to accomplish its economic, political, and security objectives. From a geostrategic standpoint, several analysts in both Israel and the United States are concerned about Chinese investment in Israeli infrastructure, including vital infrastructure such as ports and rail. Chinese presence in the Haifa port has received the greatest attention and has become a symbol of tension between Israel and the US over Israel's connections with China. Haifa port is the largest of Israel's 3 ports, serving as a base for Israel's submarines and a crucial port of call for the United States Navy's 6th Fleet. The US Navy's 6th Fleet docks in Haifa port at least once a year to participate in biannual naval exercise and to assist in ballistic missile defense, bolstering Israel's land-based ballistic missile defenses by providing sea-based BMD support. Chinese presence in port might pose a risk, since it will provide China with unique information gathering capabilities. The US may need to balance its interests in the area with its concerns about Chinese collection on US military activities and potential cyber hazards to Navy ships.
Did you see that, folks? That's right. That's the President of the People's Republic of China, Xi Jinping, meeting with the former Prime Minister of the occupied state of Israel, Benjamin Mikhailovsky, aka Benjamin Netanyahu, talking about, technology. And if you were watching the clip, you would see that, that the creator was complaining about the close ties between China and Israel being a major national security threat. How many of your so-called pundits, mainstream media guys, and even alt media cult leaders have told you about this? All these people can somehow tell you that the West is evil and imperialist and that Bashar al-Assad and the mullahs occupying Iran and their Hezbollah, ironically called Army of God in English, are supposedly going to save the day from evil. With so many of you. And by the way, the people of Syria don't support that. That's just one thing to be made clear. The people of Syria don't support him, they hate him because he's a murderous lunatic who is best friends with Israel, best friends with Iran, best friends with China. No, the Assad regime, evil giant fascist China built a node, which when I heard of it, it basically had me laughing shot because it shows how stupid these silly tankies and delusional mainstream media cult guys are. showing no brainless there once again and showing that these guys have real critical thinking skills. So, yeah.
يسقط بشار الاسد يلا ايه خريه يسقط على اسرائيل روح على اسرائيل يلا على اسرائيل روح على اسرائيل لا تجي للجاي روح على يسقط اهل الكيماوي قتلت الاطفال شايلين دشات يا حراميه يا بشار كيماوي يا حراميه يا بشار كيماوي حراميه يسقط
But Breaking Bad, that's a conspiracy theory. That's a conspiracy theory, man. That's a conspiracy theory. How dare you talk about that? How dare you talk about versus Israel? The only democracy in the Middle East. That's right. That's right. Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. Despite Israel having ties with the fastest man-made China, communist Russia and England, we don't care about that, man. All we care about, man, is our feelings, man. Because orange, man. Can you talk about something else, man? Why are you so mean? Don't you see, man? Trump, man. Orban, Putin.